Blur is a 2010 vehicle combat racing game. Wait, wrong script. Blur, a band that has ticked a lot of boxes, defining not just a decade but a whole music movement, had songs reach sport anthem status and, last but not least, starred in Lego Rock Band. And today they are the focus of Ranked, the series where worst means weakest and best means best. And today we're going to do things a little bit differently. I'll be covering the history of the act in question, reviewing each release along the way, and at the end I'll give my 100% objective ranking of Blur's discography. So I guess a good place to start would be the end. And there we have it, folks, every Blur album ranked from worst to best. I think we're probably better just starting from the start. In 1988, David Albarn's musical venture was well underway, starring in the band Circus alongside guitarist and childhood friend Graham Coxon and drummer David Rowntree. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place in December of that year as bassist Alex James would join, and with that addition came a new name, the one we've all grown to love. Seymour?
Oh. That's much worse.
With a diverse bunch of influences driving the band, everything from Dinosaur Jr. to European avant-garde theatre, Seymour would grind away for the next year, which would culminate in a record deal with Food Records. If that sounds too good to be true, that's because it is, as there are two requirements before the deal can go ahead. The first one is a proper butterfly effect, as one of the defining acts and movements of the 90s could have potentially never happened if David Rowntree continued to wear pyjama bottoms at gigs. The second, and least contentious, is a name change, and after juggling suggestions like The Government, bad, Shining Path, bad, and Whirlpool, objectively perfect, the band would decide on Blur, as it was a bit arty but not obscure, which, spoiler alert, is pretty much the act's motto going forward. So in March 1990, Food Records signed Blur and released their first single, She's So High, to critical buzz. Shortly after, Blur got into the studio with Steve Power, though those sessions would prove unfruitful, leading to the introduction of Stephen Street, who had worked on the Smiths' final record, Strange Phase, Here We Come. And in August of 1991, the world would get their first proper taste of Blur. Let's not waste any more time, let's just dive right into Leisure. And where better to start than with the opener, a confident psychedelic opener that She's So High, the first song that Blur ever made. And honestly, it sets a pretty good bar. It gives off this lovely floating sensation, and I think does a pretty good job at batting away claims that Blur were merely just playing things safe. Granted, Leisure isn't an album full of moments like this. Sing, the delicious bass-reliant Haiku, and There's No Other Way are the only tracks I would be clamouring to see in a Dream Blur setlist. That being said, considering just how good Blur will get on future releases, the fact that tracks this early on can still be in contention is noteworthy. Now from the good to the not so good. Repetition feels like the musical equivalent of a line in a parody film, showing self-awareness with its name in an attempt to make up for it being pretty droll. Speaking of droll, a complaint levied at this early inception of Blur that I can't help but agree with is the lyrics, which will go on to be one of the band's strengthiest of strengths. When it comes to the lyrics on Leisure, nothing shocking stands out. It's just like with moments in Come Together and Birthday, there's this feeling of autopilot, auto-generation, which is just a bit difficult to shake off, even if the latter is saved by an entertaining climax. Despite my nagging, Leisure is a perfectly fine first record that lays out the Blur manifesto pretty well, albeit it's a rough version with some red pepper hummus spread on a few pages. Critics at the time weren't super impressed, but they were relatively positive, though unlike their current hype riding form, where they would give one of Alex Turner's farts a 5-star rating if they could, NME were actually a bit more scathing.
Blur are really pretty good, but it ain't the future. Blur are merely the present of rock and roll.
But unlike most acts, the band still hold a fondness for their debut album. What's that scribble doing there? Anyway, after Leisure, Blur would go on to discover that they were £60,000 in debt. Don't you just hate it when that happens? And would go to America. Don't you just hate it when that happens? To embark on a tour. This 44-date tour would be pivotal beyond just making their money back, as the complete disarray of it would instill an American apathy that would guide Blur's future sound. They would also release a little non-album single called Pop Scene to mark the start of this tour that, along with the prowess of acts like Suede and Pulp, would start the moment known as Britpop. And no, that's not what British people call Coca-Cola and Pepsi. I'll actually have you know, they're called Fizzy Wizzies. Britpop was a phenomenon that would skyrocket many an act into popularity during the mid-90s just by mentioning the term, key amongst them being Blur, Pulp, Suede, and these two weird brothers. I think this is what they look like. Honestly, don't pay them any attention. With the benefit of hindsight, we know Blur would go on to have a tremendously successful career, but in 1992 that wasn't the case. Poorly received performances and the success of rival bands like Suede led to Blur potentially having a life expectancy fitting of their name. Speaking of Suede, Blur weren't best pleased with their new rival. Damon said that Suede in America fueled his desire to prove to everyone that Blur were worth it. There was nothing more important in his life than doing that. And as if things couldn't get worse, Blur's record labels weren't making it easy, rejecting the initial version of their next album in December of 1992, demanding more commercial-friendly singles. This led to For Tomorrow and Chemical World being added, though while the band were happy to meet this demand, they did reject their American label SBK's request to have the album re-recorded with Nirvana producer Butch Vig. And so in May of 1993, with their careers on the lines and with something to prove, Blur would release an album that would put them on a whole new course that would change their lives and the face of British music forever. Well, if ever there was a nominee for Best Sophomore Glow Up, Modern Life is Rubbish would be in the running. Mind you, it didn't come about smoothly. The album was originally meant to be produced by Andy Partridge of XTC fame, before sessions were deemed unsatisfactory and Stephen Street returned to take on production duties. Thankfully, any of this commotion didn't stop Modern Life is Rubbish from being one of the best albums of its time. It's worth bearing in mind the attitude shift from Leisure to Modern Life, which is something that's pretty evident when watching the Produce Like a Pro interview with Graham Coxon on this album. Don't get me wrong, for a debut album, Leisure wasn't void of any imagination, but Modern Life is just that sequel that demands and deserves your attention. Part of that comes down to the vision. A lot of media was scratching that worker apathy itch that was pretty widespread in media during the 90s with Office Space and Fight Club, and even Blur had a hand in this with Modern Life is Rubbish. While the workplace has changed a lot in the last 3 decades, the stuff that makes Blur roll their eyes is still pretty applicable nowadays. I'm thinking of a song like Starshape where Damon becomes disassociated with working life and its banality, hobbling along as he works his way up the corporate ladder. You've also got the Bowie-inspired lead single and opener For Tomorrow, which has some effective imagery of an icy Britain alongside a mawkish playground chanty chorus that represents the delusion of hoping things will just get better. The Arsler and Colin Zeal is definitely a choice, but other than that, this is a pretty fun summary of that one narcissistic person with All Mate whose work-life balance is not so much leaning into the former as it is falling into it. A takedown of the bootlicker essentially. I think what makes Modern Life an interesting take on this is that it simply isn't just spouting, isn't the 9 to 5 so demoralising in different flavours. In fact, some of the best moments come from when the band instead explore how this bleeds into other facets of life, like on Blue Jeans where Damon's love for his partner helps to drown out the monotony of his predicament, or on Chemical World, which, okay, I was just going to go on a whole spiel. It's basically that they feed us poison meme, but done well. And it's not just some lyrical marvel either, because the performances and the production on here, it's just outstanding. Graham is just showing off at this point, using all manner of pedals and effects to give this record a real 3D texture that, again, 3 decades later, just hasn't expired. This is especially true of the little out of nowhere jam sesh that is Intermission, which is attached to the end of Chemical World and sounds like the POV of a downward spiral and stands out as one of the best moments on Modern Life. Then there's Oily Water, just wow, the guitar and bass work on here is ridiculous. I especially love that stuttery tremolo at the start and just that general undercurrent of neat little tricks and effects. just Graham and Alex on top form, helping to dispel any assumptions that the Blur machine is just fueled by their handsome frontman. In a whole manner of ways, Modern Life is Rubbish was an absolute improvement on its predecessor, and that seems to be the consensus at the time as well. Many of the critics who had labelled Leisure as derivative appreciated a new direction, with specific praise lauded at Damon's improved lyrics and Graham's overall performance. Accused David Roberts going as far to say that he was first in line for Johnny Marr's vacant crown. Sure, it didn't sell as well as Leisure did, especially in the States, but that did nothing to demoralise the Blur boys, who were running on a new high, fueled by the satisfaction of making Modern Life, as well as some great praise about a Reading Festival set, a 180 of their underwhelming live performances just a year prior. This performance and an appearance at Glastonbury are captured in the 1993 documentary film Star-Shaped. The boys wasted no time at all, and by February of 1994, sessions for a new Blur album were already complete, with Stephen Street on production duties yet again. Just 2 months later, and less than a year after their last album had come out, Blur's third LP was released. And what ended up following Modern Life is Rubbish would change music forever. Where to even start with Parklife? Blur have always ensured their albums start off on their strongest foot, and Girls and Boys is another incredible opener, Alex James serving up one of the most delicious bass lines you'll ever hear. It could have very well become repetitive trite considering its lyrics feel like an Ibiza holiday anthem, but those kind of stupid lyrics, a handsome exterior with the performances, especially that little guitar flourish after the chorus, and a nice heart to it. Yep, Blur made a song that I can only describe as being definitively himbo-esque. And speaking of defining, the title track for Blur's third album and its third single, you'll know it as. It's pure unabashed fun, with some spoken word from Quadrophenia star Phil Daniels. What's it called again? What else? The tongue isn't in cheek as much as it is through it. An observational piece that is positively brimming with energy. One of the band's most popular songs for a reason, and regardless of how many times I've seen it used to dunk on an overly long sentence, it's still a 10 out of 10 track for me. And there's plenty more going on beyond the big singles. A general touch that I really dig on Parklife is the inclusion of brassy sections like on Jubilee and the title track. It just gives that cheeky ambition that was evident on Modern Life a little oomph, making the album feel on par with, and at times one up in its predecessor for creativity and fun. Another area Parklife doesn't falter in is the lyrics, following through on a lot of the same social analytical themes of Modern Life. Tracy Jacks is a great example of this, one of my all-time favourite Blur tracks, that follows the titular character who undergoes a midlife crisis, but goes about it in extravagant ways. Not like Walter White from Breaking Bad, who makes questionable facial hair choices and wears silly hats. That's what that show's about, right? I just love how the ways he acts out are escalated and are boosted by those performances, giving them that oomph. The chorus perfectly encapsulating that bubbling resentment and anger before being paid off by that lush arrangement. London Love scratches a similar itch, taking a hit at how materialistic the world is getting. I especially love the little falsetto gang vocals on here. Very good and goofy. And last but not least, maybe one of you has already commented about the fact that I haven't praised David Rowntree specifically in this video yet. Maybe your username is Ravid Downtree, who knows. But 3 albums in, I'd like to say that he's a pretty good drummer. Much in the same way that you never really take notice of editing unless it's done poorly, the drumming on every Blur album is just so on point that it never really draws attention to itself, a reliable backbone that if you listen out for it, you'll definitely notice and be impressed by it. If it wasn't obvious already, Parklife is a fantastic album, and critics at the time didn't display any hesitancy when it came to praising it. A whole wave of critical acclaim washed over this new Blur album, one of those records where it's more interesting to see who didn't praise it as opposed to who did. Case in point, Robert Christgau, who had popped on my radar before due to an infamous review of Cocteau Twins' Bluebell Knoll. According to Robert, the only good song in here is Girls and Boys, which is at least a kinder compliment than saying an album is so open-minded that his brain fell out. Back onto that positive reception, and while it's only known nowadays as that award show where Madonna fell down a set of stairs wearing a cape, Parklife did exceptionally well at the Brits, netting Blur 4 awards and winning every category that they were nominated in.
I think this should have been shared with Oasis.
In addition to that, Parklife would debut at number 1 in the UK and at number 6 in the US, making Parklife a mega successful album that would help Blur to become the biggest band in Britain, a title that they would hold on to indefinitely. Who's that? Yeah, we can't really avoid this conversation any longer, can we? Blur versus Oasis. At this point, it's already well documented, a part of music history, a feud that can only be contested by the inner turmoil of Oasis itself. Despite how well known it is though, it can almost feel like people both overhype and underplay just how big a deal this ordeal was, with music mags and tabloid rags getting in on it. On the one hand, Blur and Oasis really were at one another's throats.
It's the least reliable. Them Blur boys in Finger, there was a pool table at the top, and I remember launching snooker balls at their heads. They were not sitting down and having drinks.
However, there were other layers applied to it by the media. South versus North, privately educated versus not privately educated, nice haircuts versus shit haircuts.
It's been described as the British Heavyweight Pop Music Championship. In one corner, 4 young middle-class men from the south of England, collectively known as Blur, and in the other corner, 5 young working-class men from Manchester, called Oasis.
It took no time at all for the art school wankers versus working-class heroes narrative to take place, and while publications like NME definitely fanned the flames of this rivalry, it's not as if punches weren't thrown by the band members themselves. Search for Blur vs Oasis compilations and you will find them. There were more than a few words thrown here and there, but it's evident that the rivalry was exaggerated by the press, as it would eventually get to the point that the two bands would deal with this in the most British way possible, by playing a game of football, which Blur would go on to win 2-1. A heated relationship, sure, but one that would have been a bit spicy rather than red hot had it not been for the media at the time. This tension would peak with what was called the Battle of Britpop, where Blur moved Country House a week forward so that it would go head to head with Roll With It by Oasis. And I guess the question is to ask who won this battle. Well, maybe it's worthwhile talking about the album that Country House appeared on. The Great Escape, or as I like to call it, Chicken Run, was released in September of 1995, and I won't leave you waiting any longer. Is Country House any good? Noel Gallagher seems to think both it and Roll With It were shit, and when is he ever wrong? Oh. Anyway, Country House objectively won this battle, selling almost 60,000 copies more than Roll With It, but when it comes down to the quality, it also won. Roll With It is a fine, inoffensive rock tune, and while Country House isn't breaking any boundaries, there's just more going on, or of that Blur charm. Had it gone up against another What's the Story Morning Glory cut, maybe Don't Look Back in Anger, then we'd be having a different conversation, but as it stands, the British public got it right with this one. Just don't bring up any election from the 2010s, or the Love Island 2021 final, okay? Funny that I bring up Country House first. Is it though? As Damon Albarn admitted nearly 2 decades later, that the media circus around it and the Britpop scene at large is what inspired most of the songs on The Great Escape. Take a look at Charmless Man, which is so much more than a funny haha twist of the Smiths classic. Sure, the refrain might be vapid school playground fodder, but it works for what the song's going for, an airtight takedown of what I'll politely refer to as a posh thick kid. Makes claims that this is about Suede frontman Brett Anderson, the ex of Elastic frontwoman and Damon's girlfriend Justine Frischmann, all the juicier. Best Days is the kind of song that I'd have laughed at a few years ago, but considering it's a song written from the perspective of your mid to late 20s speaking to your young adult self, there's something kinda poignant and lovely about it. Can imagine Damon writing this to boost his and the rest of the band's morale during a particularly grueling time. And on another note, would you look at that? Fade Away, a funky little track where I can draw specific attention to David Rountree's drumming, him and some beefy horns soundtracking the tale of a dejected marriage. Mr. Robinson's Congo? Where are you hiding the weapons? We also have the Universal, and look, we have a bit of an unwritten conundrum here, and by that, I do mean Natasha Bedingfield. Bet you weren't expecting that in your Blur video, eh? What I mean is that both songs, to me and I'm sure countless other UK based folk, are well written, lovely tracks that we still enjoy to this day, but from time to time, part of our brains auto fill in with the commercial chatter we expect after hearing them in adverts all the time.
Introducing new Pantene.
Reach us every day, even over Christmas. Look after your world this Christmas with British Gas.
This isn't the track itself's fault, just an experienced downside that comes with living on this cursed wee island. I've been pretty positive about The Great Escape so far, but the vigilant amongst you will notice that I've only really discussed the first half of this album. That's because the second half isn't quite as interesting, with Entertain Me being the only memorable highlight, with another delicious Alex James bassline. An underrated gem in my opinion. I'm feeling a bit of a Cure comparison coming on here, and that's because both The Cure and Blur help to define a sound with a trilogy, and in the case of The Cure, each entry in that trilogy was just as essential as the last, whereas with Blur, and in the case of The Great Escape, I don't quite feel like it upped Blur's level. There's plenty to like about this album, but Modern Life and Parklife just feels so much more jam-packed with fun ideas and interesting insights. A good album that so happens to bookend a trilogy of greatness. That doesn't seem like too hot a take, as upon release The Great Escape was received pretty well critically, though not as much as what came before. There was also this critic who, years later, made his distaste for this album known. Shake off screenshot. Anyway, do you remember how Parklife won all the awards it was nominated for at the Brits? Well, history repeated itself as The Great Escape got Blur nominated 4 times and it won nothing. Absolutely nothing. Hell, even Batman Forever won something. That's when you know it hasn't been a great night. In fact, those pesky lads Oasis would beat them in 3 of those categories, but thankfully, the band put any tension to the side and celebrated in a sportsmanly manner, returning the kind words Blur gave them in 1995.
Oh, people, so many people, and they walk your counting hands, and in hands through their shite life.
What did you think was going to happen? Yeah, What's the Story knows a Tory both then and now is remembered a lot more fondly than The Great Escape, so while Country House had won the battle, history shows that Oasis won the war, at least when it comes to commercial success. Speaking of commercial success, The Great Escape outperformed Parklife in every country except the UK. I can't seem to figure out any reason why that's the case, but considering it's the second best-selling album of the band's discography, it doesn't seem like it would have any impact on where the band would go next. The Great Escape also performed well in Asia, which led to the Live at the Budokan live album in 1996. Keep that in mind 2 decades from now. And Damon Albarn would score an absolute screamer in a football match with Massive Attack and Supergrass, which has no relevance to the story of Blur, other than I think that it's quite cool. Anyway, while the chart performance of the album wouldn't rock the boat, what would have an impact was Graham, who was beginning to become a bit disgruntled with the trivial nature of this Oasis rivalry.
I just found it very cheap, the whole attention that was put on it, that sort of focus, that sort of battle of Britpop, working class northerners and shandy drinking southerners, you know, battle it out for the #1 slot. Like, oh, do us a favour.
As well as where the band were stylistically, that only growing when across the pond a whole heap of exciting alt-rock acts like Pavement, Beck and the Modest Mouse were thriving. It annoyed him so much that he really turned into a cardboard cutout of himself during a performance in Italy. Things were pretty bad for Blur following this Britpop battle. After interviewing the band in the months following it, Adrian Devoy of Q said,
Graham is grumpy and drinking too much. He thinks Alex is being a tosser. Alex and Damon aren't seeing eye to eye. Damon thinks Alex is taking too many drugs and overdoing the pop star bit. Alex thinks Graham and Damon have sided against him, and that Damon is becoming a little too megalomaniac for his liking. No one can quite figure out what Dave is thinking. Graham privately suspects that Dave might be an alien.
Clearly things weren't going so well, especially when Oasis were having success in a way Blur weren't, America taking a liking to their Cool As You Like tunes. So, in 1997, Blur would go through yet another reinvention that would either make or break them for good. So what was the mantra of Blur's 5th album? Well, this little interview snippet would probably do it.
I wrote Damon a letter just before we recorded Blur. I said I wanted to scare people again. The letter worked.
While Blur's self-titled effort isn't Giles Corey, pee your pants type scary, it is big, it is monstrous, and it made one hell of an impact. Case in point, Song 2. While it's meant to be a parody of grunge or pop rock hits, is there really any argument to be made that it isn't an absolute anthem? Just one of the biggest tunes to ever do it. Joining Creep in the pantheon of songs that started off as jokes but became seriously big hits, Song 2 is and forever will remain Blur's biggest song. It's probably the first thing you've ever heard from him, and while it's not hugely representative of their sound or career, it shows that the band's effort to experiment regularly paid off. Disillusioned and actively antagonistic towards them, America Let Bygones Be Bygones as Song 2 was a hit across the pond. Finally, Blur weren't just a British novelty. And they managed to do this without dumbing their sound down, as the ambition evident on their Britpop trilogy could still be seen here, just in a different flavour. You don't have to look any further than lead cut Beetlebum. Long gone was the sunshine-drenched twee of a single-like country house. Here was a sulky, gloomy affair, which marked a shift from observing to reflecting. Damon documenting his struggle with heroin. Remember when this band used to sing about being a naughty boy? To this day, one of the band's best tunes, and the fact that it followed up something, as Graham Coxon remarks, so kitsch is mind-boggling to think of. It's clear that Damon left his mark on this project with some really personal lyrics, but Blur's late 90s output bore the mark of Graham more now than ever. He was getting to wear his influences with pride, and reflecting with Record Collector magazine, he said,
I was always trying to mess around and be noisy and more exploratory with guitars, because I was listening to the Americans.
This intent is more than a little noticeable, an experimental flair being exercised in a way no Blur record had since the Modern Life days. Just take a look at, or well, listen to Country Sad Ballad Man, which starts off sounding like the kind of track that would soundtrack a venture into the swamp, only for it to become a bitter battle of Alex James' bass and Graham's guitar, both men vying for supremacy. No matter who came out on top, we as listeners won. Really, there's no shortage of songs that channel this rambunctious new attitude. You've got On Your Own that packs a punchy, jittery synth and cocky lad gang vocals so powerful that David had to hide away in a hole. The Coxon fronted You're So Great, which features a rare vocal performance from the man himself, as well as some adventurous guitar playing, and Death of a Party, another track that's unlike anything the band had put out yet, with Graham's guitar work colouring outside of the lines. Right down to Closer, Essex Dogs, a phenomenal track that threatens to fall apart at any second throughout its 8-minute runtime, sounding like a PC made out of marzipan trying to run 100 tabs at once. Blur's self-titled album is a blast. Not only would it have been an exciting album at the time, I was only one, so my music reviewing abilities hadn't quite developed yet, but 25 years later, self-titled is still an exhilarating time. And I promise this is the last time I bring up Oasis in this video, but the gamble of this shift away from the Britpop movement ultimately seemed to be a worthy gamble, both for the quality of this record as well as commercial viability. Britpop only became bigger and bigger, meaning anyone involved would have to meet those lofty expectations. Oasis tried to meet those with Be Here Now, received well enough at the time, but largely seen now as a bloated mess that the band wouldn't really recover from, at least not critically. Don't get me wrong, big things were still expected of Blur. When news broke out that the band would be switching things up, the term commercial suicide was thrown about more than a few times, and for the quality of the work and not any artificial hype from certain outlets, Blur 1997 went on to become the band's best-selling album to date, just as the Britpop bubble burst. 5 albums in, and contrary to other acts, their integrity wasn't in any doubt. So after this, Blur naturally wanted to take things a bit easy after undergoing such a serious reinvention, except they absolutely did not. Alex stated just how eager the band were to continue tinkering, saying that this approach to change was key to Blur, an act always in need of undergoing metamorphosis. Ultimately, the next Blur album would be defined by the dissolution of 2 relationships. Firstly was the decision to drop producer Stephen Street, who had been at the helm of every Blur album up until this point, the band replacing him with the electronica-orientated William Orbit. Secondly, and most importantly, was Damon's split with long-term girlfriend Justine Frischmann.
That relationship just absolutely crashed. I mean, you know, it really was a spectacularly sort of sad end.
Damon would subsequently move in with a roommate he was introduced to by Graham Coxon. Not sure of the relevance, but everyone brings it up, so I guess why shouldn't I? All of this, in addition to a studio civil war between Damon's experimental aspirations and Graham's more punk-centric stylings, made the studio sessions miserable. Damon admitting years later that new producer William Orbit had to take on another role as band psychiatrist. With people turning up drunk, chucking verbal abuse, storming off, or just not showing up at all, could this next Blur album be their last? If Coxon's sulky, oil-painted man on the album artwork, or that unlucky number forming the first initial of the band's name didn't give it away, 13 is an even darker flavour of the Blur we came to know on their last album. And while the sessions behind it may have been toxic and tumultuous, there are no two ways about it. 13 is Blur's most interesting album. Yet, despite it being their most experimental record to date, 13 is home to some of Blur's most popular tracks ever. Lead single Tender is a track that does it all. A 7-minute cathartic, heartfelt folk epic written about Damon's breakup with Frischmann that retains its quality throughout its runtime, thanks to its anthemic chorus with the help of the London Community Choir. It also worked well in a Co-op Christmas advert. What more could you ask for? And for another track that does it all, Coffee and TV. While not his first track on lead vocals, Coffee and TV is an objectively more confident performance from Graham. It's got a sentient carton of milk, aptly called Milky, an adorable organ outro, and an appearance in Pine Barrens, one of The Sopranos' best episodes. It's not unusual, nor is it hard to understand why this ranks as a favourite for so many Blur fans. It's almost enough to distract you from the fact this song is the culmination of all that battle of Britpop faff, with Graham reflecting on the trivialness of celebrity and also about his plight with alcoholism, which was in part due to that media-inflated rivalry. I did say Self-Titled had Graham's fingerprints all over it more than any Blur album before, but in the case of 13, it's metaphorically and literally got his brushstrokes all over it, even if Damon still deserves a lot of credit for wearing his tattered heart on his sleeve. Ask a room of Blur fans whose album this is, and you'll not get a definitive answer. The parts I enjoy most are mostly Graham's contributions, but both men are on their A game. And when it came to the zanier out there cuts, 13 isn't running short on contenders. The Albarn and Coxon style tensions come to a head with a track that immediately succeeds with their Tender, Bugman. This feels part punk jam session, part rave, but wholly is an absolute tour de force. Graham provides one of the most eclectic guitar performances of his career, an industrial track so full of highlights for him that you could compose a top 5 moments list from this track alone. That's all backed up masterfully by Alex James' catchy bass playing and Damon's reverb-laden mischievous vocals, which both add to the chaotic nature of this track. And then there's what may be David's best performance on a Blur song, especially during that cacophonous outro. If I had a locked-in contender for best Blur track, then Bugman would definitely be up there along with Coffee and TV. The quality doesn't stop there as we get to Swamp Song, an almost spiritual successor to Beetlebum, as it focuses yet again on Damon's heroin addiction and the parallels of said addiction between that and his longing for Frischmann, one pushing him away from the other. It is pretty subtle about it. And it also has this line. The highlights on here are endless. I could spend the next hour dissecting each and every track. I just love how bloody weird it can be, like Blur EMI, which just sounds like an active attempt to give the heads at Food Records a heart attack. Despite nearly teetering off the edge of a cliff, Blur had put out yet another album that could vie for the title of their magnum opus. Most bands are lucky to get one, yet 4 of their 6 albums at this point had a strong claim to the throne. Critics at the time didn't shy away from embracing this new Blur album with open arms, A particularly strong piece of praise came from Pitchfork, who said,
"In a way, Blur is one of the last big, old-school album bands. A band more concerned with their entire career than radio singles. More concerned with album than song. The reason why is simple. When a band is really, really good, they consistently make good records. Duh."
13 is an epilogue to a movement, an epilogue to a relationship, but more importantly, it's a new chapter for Blur. So what happened next? A pretty notable moment was the release of Blur, the best of, in 2000, which I can pinpoint as my first proper taste of the band thanks to my best friend Louis having it in decent rotation, which I can vividly remember him keeping it in one of those huge CD holders, the greatest honour that can be bestowed upon an album. I was originally going to put together a playlist of essential Blur tunes, before realising that every song I had on there appeared on this. The only omissions were songs released after it came out, and I guess I can't judge an album too much for not being able to transport through space and time. For now. Despite being up there with Rotten Apple was one of the strongest greatest hits collections any band had put out, Blur the Best Of would have a sad tinge to it, as it was the final Blur release on the Food Records label that had given the band their big break. What else? Oh, yeah, that roommate that Damon was introduced to by Graham. Well, it turns out that A, his name was actually Jamie Hewitt, and B, he had ambitions greater than being just an anonymous footnote in a random YouTube video, and along with Damon, would go on to form Gorillaz.
I ain't happy, I'm feeling glad I got sunshine in a bag.
I'd love to talk about them more, maybe a future ranked video contender, maybe, but the gist is their eponymous debut album came out in March 2001 and was a critical and commercial success. After their members collaborated on different projects or went on solo ventures, getting their creative kicks elsewhere, the band would eventually reunite in 2001 to get to work on their 7th album. Thankfully, any remaining tensions that had been rife during the recording of 13 had subsided by the time the band got together, and Graham Coxon left the band. Graham Coxon left the band?
Now let me ask you about Graham, because Graham's not in the band anymore. Graham Coxon, I know he's done a couple of solo things. Do you know why he left? I mean, what actually happened then?
You got lovely eyes, you know.
Yeah, due to Graham battling depression and alcoholism, he wasn't there for the initial 2001 recording of their upcoming album. He would return for a series of recording sessions in February of 2002, but was asked to leave after just 5 days due to the band feeling like it wasn't going well with him there.
It's like your girlfriend saying, look, I'm not chucking you, but I don't want to see you for a bit, and, you know, make of that what you will.
Making their next album the first without Graham as a full-time member. So, after all this, what album did we actually end up getting? With all that pressure, did this tense situation produce a diamond for Blur's 7th album? You tell me. Look, while I think 13 is the most interesting Blur album, in the context of their career, Think Tank is, I don't know, the most fascinating. A core member down, the band decided to take a trip to Morocco, staying in Marrakesh, where they equipped an old barn with a studio to produce 3 tracks that are pretty unlike anything they'd put out at this point. First up is the Fatboy Slim credited Crazy Beat, which I just played, and it's not for me. This is erratic, even by Gorillaz era Albarn standards, and feels weird just for weird's sake, emblematic of Think Tank's messy nature. It sounds as if someone trained some AI to try and recreate Bugman. It's just the crazy straw that broke the crazy camel's back. Then there's Moroccan People's Revolutionary Bulls Club, one of many songs on Think Tank that makes that Banksy painting artwork make all the more sense, with the song lamenting the topic of mutually assured destruction, something that was on the minds of many at the time due to the Iraq war that started in 2003. Lyrically tight and brief and sonically all over the place, this is one of the very few political tracks by mainstream acts at the time that has aged well. And finally, the funky Gene by Gene, another collaboration with Fatboy Slim, though thankfully this one manages to find the weirdo sweet spot. Damon's bo 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 after the chorus giving me Katamari Damacy vibes, the rusty wheel suspension sound effect given me, coupled doing the beast with two backs on top of my Vauxhall Corsa. The existence of these tracks goes to show that Blur continued with a more jammy, out there approach, going directly against the more mainstream pitch that Damon had been keen about pursuing. The only track that seemed to have any chart appeal was lead single Out of Time, which, listening to it, doesn't seem like the kind of track that would reach number 5 in the charts. Regardless, a shining bass performance from Alex, a wonderful contribution for a Marrakesh-based orchestra segment, and some more socially aware commentary from Damon makes this another needed goodie. Preaching to the choir here, probably, but Think Tank just feels like the moment where all the tiffs and tensions behind the scenes just leaked into the music in a kind of messy way. Something that both benefits and acts as a detriment is the lack of a clear vision, with William Orbit, Ben Hiller, and the aforementioned Fatboy Slim himself, Norman Cook, all sharing production credits. That's not to imply that an album can't be good or focused with many Cooks involved, and there is inventiveness, a throw everything at the wall and see what sticks mentality that does lead to some great moments like Opener Ambulance, which makes it immediate how shaken up things are, some dark, desolate synths rummaging through this exotic flavour alongside some interesting percussion. There's also a good song which could have been easy to ridicule had it not ended up being a heartfelt acoustic number, with Damon pitching in with a nifty guitar performance, one of the catchiest ones I've ever heard in a Blur album to be honest, which is extra impressive considering this is a role he had to fill in due to Graham's absence. However, it just as easily leads to some duds. I've already talked enough about Crazy Beat, and Brothers and Sisters is one that I really want to like, but with each new ingredient chucked into the pot, like those goofy, squishy synths and the pretty trite narrative, it just ends up being a turn off for me. Think Tank is a double-edged sword, and if I had to compare it to any album, it kinda reminds me of what Radiohead did with The King of Limbs, a curveball late career move that definitely has admirers, but at the cost of alienating a decent chunk of their fan base. That doesn't make it right or wrong, it just makes it unique, and for that, I'll happily commend Think Tank for showcasing Blur's commitment to never resting on their laurels. A good album, sometimes even a great album, that wows me almost as often as it does sour me. While I'm not the biggest cheerleader for Think Tank, there were plenty of people and critics at the time that were eager to praise it, and it ended up on more than a few end of year lists. And in fact, according to Acclaimed Music, Think Tank is one of the 1,000 most critically acclaimed albums ever, so that's something. Yet, despite the positive feedback and having the biggest sway on the album's direction, Damon has been less favourable about this album over time, saying in 2015,
"It's got some real stinkers on it. There's some bollocks on there."
The usual happened after this new album came out, like a whole host of tour dates, including a headline slot at Reading and Leeds, and sending a piece of music into space on board a lander. Who hasn't had their music played on Mars? Something most of us can admit to having not done is participate in a car crash interview with music legend Nardwar, speaking as someone with largely unsupervised access to the internet growing up. This video is really hard to sit through. I will say that David has since apologised for his behaviour in this interview and actually keeps a clip of it as an aid to not take drugs, which he was abusing at the time. And on that note of difficult things to sit through, strap yourselves in folks, because Think Tank marks the start of a very long... There's a lot to cover during this period, so for the sake of simplicity, we'll just run through it year by year.
To the left. Take it back now, y'all.
Graham is the busiest of the bunch as he kicks things into top gear, getting his first solo UK top 40 hit and releasing his 5th solo album, Happiness in Magazines. Damon gets to lose emotion on a new Gorillaz album and listen to the help of hip-hop producer Danger Mouse. And in amongst all of this, buzz about a new Blur EP emerges as the band, bar Graham, return to the studio for a few sessions.
Is this the way you do?
If last year was Cox and Crazy, then 2005 was Damon Dense. While Graham did get up to a bit, still promoting his latest solo album and working on the next, Gorillaz went from being already big to gigantic. After a string of successful singles, Demon Days would be released in May 2005, an album that needs no introduction, a big deal that has only grown in popularity and importance since. When it came to news about Blur, 2005 was definitely more plentiful. Damon admitted that without Coxon there was a terrible hole in Blur and wished they would reconcile soon. In the meantime, the ambitions for a new album were a bit lighter, with a very basic punk record being the goal. Despite that, Alex said what they had cooking would make Foo Fighters wet their pants, though a gig to showcase these tunes would be cancelled so that they could work on them further. Dave Grohl's Boxers can breathe a sigh of relief.
Does that make me crazy?
And David Grohl's Boxers can continue to be as dry as Shift in the Sandland, as those Blur EP plans seem to fade away, every member of the band up to something else. Damon announces another stacked project, this time The Good, The Bad and The Queen, with the Clash's Paul Simonon, Fela Kuti's Tony Allen and The Verve's Simon Tong. Graham puts out another solo album, Love Travels at Illegal Speeds. Alex has a go at a side project of his own called Wigwam with 90s pop star Betty Boo, though it doesn't break into the charts at all. And David goes on the road with new band The Ailerons. Really, the only Blur news that came from 2006 is Graham, who was toying with the idea of returning to Blur. Alex James says that with or without Graham, there would be a new Blur album, though preferably with. And on the other hand, Damon was pretty set on not starting up the Blur machine until Graham returns. The Good, The Bad and The Queen released their debut to good reviews. Alex's autobiography Bit of a Blur is published, but more importantly, all of Blur, including Graham, meet up for lunch to discuss the future of the band. Ultimately, they decide not to give it a go-ahead until Graham and Damon have made up. In Graham's own words, that could be years away. Blur announced that they're back. They'll be playing Hyde Park next summer, and fans and media alike go wild, with tickets selling out ridiculously fast. I'm going in for the kill. And so, it finally happened. Blur and Lego Rock Band. Better than 100 new Blur albums. Also, Blur play those 2 dates at Hyde Park on July 2nd and 3rd, which are received very well, with a live album releasing the month after. The previous month they played Glastonbury, which was also heralded as a comeback Blur fans wanted and deserved. Sadly, there are still no new plans for a Blur album, with all of the members focusing on different side projects. Earlier that year, Graham had put out his 7th solo album, The Spinning Top, and Damon premiered some new material for an upcoming Gorillaz album. And a third Gorillaz album, Plastic Beach, is released in March. It's an okay album, but for the first time in 7 years, we get our first proper new Blur song, released on Record Store Day called Fool's Day. Damon is adamant to set the record straight, saying more one-off singles could be expected, but a new album isn't in the works. Released alongside this is a new Blur documentary, No Distance Left to Run, which features plenty of unseen gig performances and interviews. Blur are still meeting up in the studio, but still have no plans in place for new music. As David puts it,
we've got all our mates back, and that's the main thing. That's the one thing we don't want to lose.
In the world of solo ventures, Alex debuts a cheese festival that goes horribly wrong. Whether I'm referring to the massive debt or this picture is up to you. And Damon creates yet another group, this time with Flea and Tony Allen. The Damon music universe never stops growing.
Hey, I just met you, and this is crazy.
Perhaps the busiest Blur year during this sort of hiatus. Blur recorded a couple of songs with Volume Orbit, including Under the Westway, that is premiered at a War Child pre-Brit show. Unfortunately, Damon and Graham aren't happy with how the sessions went and decide to produce the song themselves, and in July of that year, release It and The Puritan. This was all overshadowed by the band's massive performance closing out the London Olympics, which would lead to the live album aptly titled Parklife. It's a brilliant time, and if you're clamouring to see Blur perform like I am, this will help to tide you over.
She's up all night to the sun, I'm up all night to get some.
A pretty quiet year all in all. Blur do kick off on a world tour that does hit a bit of a bump, with 2 dates in Asia being cancelled, though not ones to be lazy. Blur end up renting a Hong Kong studio for 2 days to have a few sessions to jam out, though whether or not anything will come of these sessions is unknown. Something comes from those Hong Kong sessions, as Damon reveals 15 song ideas have been recorded, though work on them will be put on hold, primarily due to his first solo album, Everyday Robots, releasing in April. It's a pretty neat album, worth a listen. In the meantime, Graham gets to work on fleshing those ideas out with Stephen Street. They show their work, which is being kept secret from everyone, even the members' children, to Damon, who agrees to put pen to paper and add some lyrics. And all this waffling, a 12-year-long saga, comes to an end the following year with the release of Blur's much anticipated 8th record. I do love an album that wastes no time getting to the point, and The Magic Whip does just that with Lonesome Street. After so long away, we get a tried and tested Blur formula. The band knows we want Graham's return to be noticeable, so they give us a cracking lead guitar performance, and even a stab at lead vocals, both of which have been dearly missed. We also want some A+ observations from Damon, and we get just that passive-aggressive and pensive lyrical style that worked so well on Modern Life is Rubbish being very much present here. After such a jaunty time, New World Towers brings the mood down a bit, though not at the expense of the quality. It's a sulky little tune all about loneliness in the 21st century, very much inspired by Damon's solo work, and the little megaphone effect on his voice reminds me a lot of the stuff he's done with Gorillaz, which is never a bad thing. You may have guessed already, but The Magic Whip is an album that is very much indebted to what came before, and I'm well aware that some fans dislike or just aren't as hot on this album for that reason. Personally though, with an act that has explored and spearheaded so many forays, fresh material that acts as a selection of greatest hits, exploring those different flavours, that's always going to go down well, especially when said material is so regularly great as it is on The Magic Whip. Unlike self-titled and 13, where it felt like Damon and Graham were constantly battling for whose album it was, The Magic Whip is a very special type of swan song album where every member has their time to shine and has more than a few highlights to speak of. One of my favourite moments on this album is Ice Cream Man, where Dave's drumming and Alex's bass playing are fundamental to my enjoyment. Speaking of great bass playing, Terracotta Heart. I love how it has some showing off time after the chorus, a kind of understated moment that makes a mark. Speaking about this track and its lyrics, Damon said,
"It's about a grown man singing about another grown man. This record is, in a way, the last piece of the jigsaw, of us getting our friendship back together. And writing about that was part of it. How we'd lost it."
Yet another wholesome slice of Blur. Damon provides a great late career vocal performance, and on that note of wholesomeness, Ong Ong, which is like a lovely spiritual successor to Blue Jeans from Modern Life. Positively upbeat, this track was made between 2014 and 2015, but it just feels so timeless with its lovey-dovey message and lovely embellishments, every aspect of this song just clicking together in a satisfying way. I could listen to this song while doing some dire chores like cleaning litter trays, and I'd still have a huge smile on my face. It's not all gold, the overpopulation stuff aside, Too Many Others really doesn't do it for me despite some admittedly cool production choices. There are some other moments like I Broadcast where that think tank approach of going out there doesn't really succeed, but just like that album, I can respect the intent while admitting it doesn't add to the experience for me. One of the most impressive things about The Magic Whip is how it doesn't feel like they've missed a beat at all. There's definitely a concept, a batch of themes explored in some interesting ways like Pyongyang's diary entry of Damon's time in North Korea, but if I'm being quite honest, most of my enjoyment derives from this bunch of pals working together to make another exciting sounding record. There are plenty of iconic British act reunions that feel a bit purposeless, but that's not the case with Blur. This is yet another record of theirs that doesn't feel like an outing for the sake of it. So now that we've covered every Blur album, it's time to get to what many of you will have came to this video for. Let's rank every Blur album from worst to best. Starting with...
There's no other way, there's no other way. All that you can do is watch them.
For some bands, the debut album is this thing where everything falls into place perfectly. And for bands like Blur, it's a humble beginning that as they go on and ascend higher, it'll be like looking down at a swarm of ants. Leisure isn't bad or even forgettable. It's just a solid starter before a banquet of gourmet food. As opposed to Leisure's problem of not having a definitive satisfying sound, The Great Escape is an example of an act who are wearing out theirs. I won't deny that there are quite a few goodies on here, showing that even when running on empty, Blur could pull out of the bag. It's just that for me, when reflecting on their discography as a whole, there are either Blur albums that do this sound better, or ones that just try something completely different and subsequently grab my attention more. I'd say it's worth a go if you're a completionist or want to get a better understanding of the Battle of Britpop. It's just a bit too complacent for me to recommend any further than that. Oh, the curious case of Think Tank, an album that produces at least one contender for my least favourite Blur song ever, a record that has a vision both lyrically and production wise that is a bit unfocused, and yet the more I jotted in my feelings on this one, the more positive I became. I could just bring up the age-old critic cliche and say I respect it more than I actually like it, but there's a part of me that respects and genuinely enjoys Think Tank for flipping the chessboard upside down and having Blur continue with their match mid-motion. It's every bit as ugly, as it is beautiful, and it's every bit as defining a Blur record as their most adored work.
Yeah, 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 yeah. The island of black cards, the wishing tree. I wanna be with you.
While Think Tank is a fun experimentation, the Magic Whip is basically the complete opposite. A run through of everything the band have done successfully so far, yet it feels like a contemporary victory lap. We have done this, Blur say, and here we are, doing it just as well all these years later. I can see the argument for preferring Think Tank over this, trust me, I was there multiple times throughout the making of this video, but when it comes down to the reality of both records, the Magic Whip is just that bit more concrete in its quality. If this really is the last album we ever get from Blur, then the Magic Whip is as good an album closer as a band of this ilk deserve. And now we reach a point that very few acts get to, and only one act in this series that I've covered has managed to, that being The Cure. And this situation is that there are 4 albums that can confidently vie for being the best Blur album. At various points throughout my life, throughout the making of this video, any of these next 4 albums have had a stint as being my go-to for the best Blur album. I won't have you waiting any longer, let's just crack on. The album that saved their career before it even began also manages to hold its own as a career-defining one. You've got to give Modern Life props for a multitude of reasons, taking the band in a whole new direction that would be pivotal in the birth of Britpop. With that, the further refinement of Graham's songwriting wizardry, and Damon Albarn lyrically levelling up. Really, the only thing that's holding Modern Life back is that there are other albums that have done this sound a bit better, or just Blur albums that have went for a completely different sound that I just enjoy a lot more. But that shouldn't take away from this being a brilliant Blur album, one of the best of its time, and for me an easy nod for whenever the conversation of best sophomore albums comes up. The first full-length Blur release I ever heard still manages to hold a sweet spot after an hour of discography analysis. Even knowing what happened before and since, there's this breath of fresh air that still lingers from it. Just like that Charlie and the Chocolate Factory DVD I had that somehow smelled of chocolate.
I am not crazy! I am not crazy!
It's confident and cocky and cool, and look, I'm not going to call Self-Titled underrated or overlooked. It's a critically acclaimed album that is sold super well and is home to Blur's best known song. But in the context of the conversation around their best album, I think it's very easy for people to brush off Self-Titled as just being a course correction, Blur getting back on track, and not the seriously impressive milestone and career highlight that it is. Yeah. If Modern Life was a reinvention, then Parklife is the refinement, the perfection of it. The sequencing is just so impressive, whether that's the informed decisions like the rambunctious Bank Holiday being followed by the more sensitive, pensive Badhead, or just how Goody is followed by Goody, followed by Goody. The speed and quality of the songwriting on here is unrelenting, and even if the argument could be made that the Debt Collector and Far Out back to back can get in the way of this pace, they don't bother me, especially when it's paid off with the top 10 Blur track that is To The End. As much as I may want to use this Simpsons scene as a visual metaphor for my feelings, I'll just say it out loud, I can't get enough of Parklife. I really respect it for how influential it is. But even more importantly, I just love that I love Parklife as much as I do Far Removed from when it came out. Yeah, it's just an important milestone for not just Britpop, but for music as a whole. It just had to be, Britpop may have played a big, maybe even the biggest role in defining who Blur are, but the album that helped him buy a place in my heart rather than rent it is 13. Not to imply that anyone was slacking before, but 13 is home to a band that are on their A game at all times. Not once does anyone slip up, and more than a few times each individual has their time to shine. It's through listening to 13 that the depth and talent of Blur becomes so real. What once seemed like a pool on their debut became a sea on subsequent releases, and with 13, it became a whole fucking ocean. Call this decision predictable, call me plain, just do not call 13 undeserving of being named the best Blur album. And there we have it, the best Blur album. We've discussed the band's discography at length. We, or at least I, have chosen what I think is their best album. Please let me know what you think their best album is, what the worst album is. But I think it's worth thinking about what happens now. Following the release of the Magic Clip, Blur went on a string of shows during 2015, finishing in November of that year, and on the back of releasing their first album in 12 years, Blur would go back to making absolutely nothing. They just went on a sort of hiatus again. Other than a one-off show in 2019 at Damon's African Express that year, it's basically been radio silence when it comes to Blur. On Cracker Island it was born. Soon after breaking Blur's absence, Damon put out Gorilla's first album in 7 years with 2017's Humans, and unlike Blur, has been putting music out fairly regularly, with 2 albums since then and another on the way. He even did another solo album last year, so it's safe to say that we'll be hearing plenty of him for the foreseeable future. Moving on, Graham has definitely been busy in the soundtrack world, providing music for the end of the fucking world, and I'm not okay with this. David continued with his political career, standing as an MP for Norwich between 2017 and 2021, and still having a music career, recently dropping his first solo single with an album on the way. Sadly, with a fast fashion documentary in 2016, Alex has been pretty hush-hush. Will we ever get a new Blur album? Damon is pretty insistent that he would want to get the band back together, stating that it is a possibility, and as recently as last year saying he'd be up for it, though being aware of not overdoing it, or just doing it for the sake of it. And speaking of not overdoing it, let's just finish this video here. Thanks for joining me on this not so little journey. Hopefully you've had as much fun watching it as I did making it, and hopefully you learned something new. I've got 2 big thank yous to give out. The first being to Trash Theory, who you've heard through this video at different points, contributed some great voiceover material, and yeah, please, if you haven't already, go check out their channel. Super insightful, very engaging. That Battle of Britpop video was not only a huge help, but was also pretty entertaining. So yeah, please go give a big thank you to him from me. And the second person that I want to thank is Vico, who runs vblurpage.com, which has been an absolute lifesaver in making this video. That website has archives of interviews, of their history, of just so many different things. It made this so much easier. So Vico, you're an absolute legend. Thank you so much. Again, let me know what you made of this video, what your personal ranking is, and if you like this different format. And if you liked the video, give it a like, subscribe, all that jazz. And if you're feeling particularly generous, then why not support me over on Patreon? It'll get you all sorts of goodies. One of those goodies will be helping me decide which albums I'll review in the next review roundup, so it's a good time to hop on. But I'll shut up now, God knows I've been speaking for far too long. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, stay safe and stay hydrated.